Hello, I am Eli Adashi, Professor of Medical Science at Brown University and host of Medscape One-on-One. Joining me today is Professor Howard Jones, Jr., whose vision and leadership gave rise to the first test tube baby in the U.S. Our topic: the just announced award of the Nobel Prize in Medicine to Professor Robert Edwards for the development of human in vitro fertilization, more commonly known as IVF. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's plain wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
And what a great day it is. Is it all smiles and no regrets?
Well, I think there is a regret. There is a regret that this should have happened, 15 years ago at least, because many of his friends did what they could to persuade the committee to make such an award some 15 years ago at least. And it's been an up and down thing, and it looked like it was a dead issue, and then suddenly this happened.
I suppose the fact that Dr. Steptoe could not be included in the award is another unfortunate outcome, perhaps, of the delay.
The rules are that they awarded only to living people, so I think that explains that. I expect that the committee was sensitive to the opposition to IVF. And that is probably what caused the delay. That opposition has been very formal with the Roman Church, informal in some other areas, but nevertheless I suspect, although I don't know this for a fact, I suspect that the Nobel Committee has been intimidated by this opposition and maybe decided to do this knowing that Bob wasn't really well, and that if it were ever going to be done, that it had to be done now. This is supposition on my part, but I believe it.
When did you first meet Dr. Edwards, and how did your interactions with him evolve over the years?
Well, do you want the long story or the short story?
We'll take both.
Well, I met Bob first in 1965, and I met him at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. It was a result of the fact that he got the idea that in vitro fertilization could be applied to the human. It had been described in the rabbit just 5 years before. He was a geneticist, basically, in mice, but was interested particularly in the genetics of reproduction. And when this information came along about in vitro fertilization being successful in the rabbit, he worked with animals and then thought they could be done in the human. But he was frustrated by the fact that he couldn't get any human eggs in Cambridge. He had had a few, and the few that he had were obtained by a gynecologist with the name of Molly Rose, who was working in London, and who happened to have been the deliverer of some of his children when he was working in London. And so with this contact, he got, I believe it was 5 eggs over a period of some months, and he became frustrated. So he wrote a letter to a friend of his at Hopkins, Victor McCusick by name, who was a geneticist. They had this in common and had met at international meetings. And he asked Victor if he were to come to Hopkins, would it be possible for him to have some human eggs? So Victor telephoned me and said he had this letter, and would there be any chance of giving Edwards some eggs if he were to come to Baltimore? And I replied that yes, I thought this would be possible, and the reason for that was that at that time, the standard treatment for a condition known as polycystic ovarian disease was wedge resection of the ovary. And we were doing 2 or 3 of those a week, and it occurred to me that, well, we could just give him part of the ovary that we removed, and he could get the eggs from that. And so that was the basis for extending the invitation to Bob to come. And he came in the summer of 1965, and during that summer attempted to fertilize human eggs in vitro. Shall I go on?
Did you have other professional interactions with him beyond national meetings and the like, along the lines of developing IVF, shall we say?
You mean subsequent to the meeting?
Subsequent to the
meeting
60s,
in Hopkins?
yeah.
Well, yes, I did. Actually, I think we had a warm friendship, and I had an open invitation to come to where they were working in England if we were in Europe, and we took advantage of that on a number of occasions. And when he would be in this country, he would stop by, and so we had a good exchange. And I always regarded him as a good company and nice to be with.
What can you tell us about Dr. Patrick Steptoe and his role in making Dr. Edwards' vision a practical reality?
Yes, well, Patrick Steptoe was, of course, a clinician, an OBGYN specialist, and was an innovator. He held a post of a consultant in a town of Oldham in England, which was near Liverpool. And this was about 150 miles, I think, from Cambridge. Patrick Steptoe introduced laparoscopy into the United Kingdom.
Could you briefly describe the technique?
Yeah, well, laparoscopy at that time was the introduction of a telescope, if you will, through a small incision in the umbilicus in the navel. And with that, one could observe the pelvis in a very unique and special way. And actually, it was Patrick
This is so-called Band-Aid surgery, or...
Yeah, I would be Band-Aid surgery, yes, to be sure. And it was when Patrick Steptoe was describing this technique at a meeting in London that Bob happened to be attending, that it occurred to Bob, well, golly day, I wonder if that could be used to harvest eggs. And so Bob, made contact with Patrick after that meeting, and they agreed to collaborate. And that's how they got together. Patrick being the clinician who retrieved the eggs, which at that time had to be done under general anesthesia with laparoscopy. And Bob was basically the laboratory person who worked with the eggs when they were given to him.
Seems fair to say that IVF would not have happened in the absence of this collaboration between a scientist and a physician.
I think it's true to say that that's the case. Now, it may have happened later by other people if they hadn't been the ones that did it, but they certainly deserve they had the idea, and they deserve the credit, and there's no question about that in my mind anyway.
History tells us that the 1978 birth of Louise Brown, the first ever
Yes.
IVF baby, followed the transfer of a single 8-cell embryo.
Yes.
In retrospect, what were the odds of that happening given the technology of the day?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you a good mathematical answer to that, but all I know is that they had been trying for a number of years. He had done at least 200 attempts before this happened. So at that time, it was 1 in 200.
Had a single embryo been transferred today, what live birth rate might we anticipate?
Oh, I think with a random selection, as we do, even with the best of intentions with the microscope, we're talking about a 30% chance.
Mm-hmm. In general, today, how does IVF compare with natural fertility in terms of the outcomes of conception.
Interestingly enough, natural fertility is an inefficient process. You wouldn't believe that, considering all the people in the world. But the truth of the matter is that every time the sperm and egg meet, there's only about 1 chance in 4 or 5 that a pregnancy and a live birth will occur. There's a big age spread, and the figure I just gave you is an average one for all ages. Reproduction becomes inefficient starting very early. Everything is downhill from about 25 on, but the curve really takes a dip in the 30s, and by the time 40 comes along, the curve is pretty flat. So the figures I'm giving you are average figures. Therefore, when you try to do IVF, you are grafting an inefficient process on an inefficient process. On an egg-to-egg basis, we've recently actually reviewed this matter, and I can give you a figure based on about over 50,000 mature eggs in our own program, and it turns out that only 1 in 20 of those eggs, as harvested, results in a live birth. So on an egg-to-egg basis, as I've said before, you have a very inefficient process on an inefficient process, and that's why IVF is so difficult to do.
For the individual patient,
yes,
in the United States, in the best possible clinic, what is the best pregnancy rate?
Well, again, this depends on the cause of the infertility, and it depends, above all, on age. And there's a little message here, if a message is suitable, and the message is that in couples thinking about getting pregnancy, remember the clock is ticking, and the curve is downhill. So the results are very much age-related, but overall these days we're looking at, and again I'm going to have to say, it depends on the number of fertilized eggs that are transferred. This is a very key issue. So there are a lot of variables, and the figures that I give you may not apply to an individual case.
Understood.
But as reported in the national data these days, we're dealing with a pregnancy rate in the 30s for each try. But we have now the possibility 30%
pregnancy rate.
Right.
Yeah.
Now we also have the chance of freezing unused fertilized eggs now, so that they can be subsequently used. So if you're talking about the pregnancy rate from a single egg harvest, it would be higher than the figure that I presented, maybe by 8% or something like that.
In the 32 years since the introduction of IVF, have we uncovered any unforeseen, indeed unintended consequences for either the mother or the child?
I think the principal unintended consequence was the matter of the multiple pregnancies. And this is a result of the inefficiency of the process, so that in order to overcome this inefficiency, more than a single egg has been transferred. And, of course, most twins, most triplets, fortunately, are perfectly well, perfectly good. But there's no doubt about the fact that as you go up in numbers, the consequences for the child become more and more troublesome. So that if we could somehow or other do away with the multiple pregnancy situation, that would be a mighty step in the right direction.
Are we moving in a reasonable way, would you say?
Yes, there is a strong movement to resort to single embryo transfers in certain circumstances. The rest of the world does a little better than the United States in regard to that. And that revolves around the insurance coverage of IVF, because in a good many European countries, IVF is covered as part of the national health system, so that they are therefore able to transfer smaller numbers. And the example I use often on that is Belgium, where in, I think it was '03, by royal decree, it was decided that you could have as many IVF attempts as necessary, up to 6, but the insurance coverage would work only if you did a single embryo transfer if you were 35 years old or less. And if you look at the data, it's interesting that the triplets essentially disappeared. And the twins, instead of running around 25 or 30% as they do in most countries, dropped down to about 5%, and most of those were from people who were older than 35, where more than one was put in as allowed by the insurance program. The United States, unfortunately, doesn't, or I don't, most people would maybe not agree with the word unfortunately, does not have general insurance coverage, so that we do not have any laws that govern IVF, so that the number to transfer are entirely on a volunteer basis, usually regulated by or influenced by guidelines that are put forward by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And I think you could make a case for saying that those guidelines maybe are not as strict as they should be in terms of a single embryo transfer. But you could also make the case that even the guidelines as they exist probably are not followed very rigorously across the country. So that the multiple pregnancy problem, I think, is something we need to work on and solve.
It sounds like the Belgians have come up, given their very special circumstances, with a policy that is both responsible and generous.
And good medicine.
And good medicine. What future innovations do you foresee for IVF?
Oh my, well, I think we have a lot of work to do. We certainly need to somehow or other identify the fertilized egg with neonatal potential, so that if we could just do that, and that's been worked on quite a bit, and it worked on from the very first part of IVF.
In other words, identify the embryos that will actually take.
That will take, and furthermore,
and
after
survive.
taking and survive, because there is a loss during pregnancy,
right,
naturally, and of course that applies to IVF as well. And that's associated usually with abnormalities of the conceptus, so that we need to somehow or other be able to identify prior to transfer by a non-invasive means the fertilized egg that has neonatal potential.
Survivability through birth and beyond.
Absolutely, right. And that's been worked on quite a bit. And the current approach to that is the use of genetic markers of various kinds, omics of all sorts, proteomics and the like. And it's a little too early to say whether that's going to work, but it's not early. We can say that it's not going to be easy, because the variables are so many that the variables are very difficult to count. So this is a work in progress, and that is a major, major thing that we need to get after.
So a search for a biomarker is on.
A search for a biomarker is on in many centers.
Were it not for IVF, the human embryonic stem cell research would not have been possible. In your personal estimation, will the recognition of IVF as a Nobel-worthy discovery impact the swirling controversy in this arena we are currently witnessing?
I would certainly hope so, but I'm not sure that it would, because the opposition, as I mentioned before, is centered around the Roman doctrine, but joined in by many other people who I guess we would call conservatives. And it's unlikely that a single prize will sway that very much, although it'll probably push it a little bit. But I think we're going to have to deal with the opposition by demonstrating that it works. And that's what's happened to IVF, because the opposition to IVF has faded through the years, and I think that it has not disappeared, but faded. And I believe the reason for that is that IVF works. And so as soon as stem cells work, I think the opposition will tend to disappear. But we're not there.
So without getting into the merits of the arguments, a deliverable would go a long way towards mitigating the debate.
Oh, I think that's right, sure.
IVF has all but vanquished barrenness as we knew it. What do you say to those who argue that infertility is not a disease?
Well, I can make a case for saying that it is not a disease. I think it's a symptom. I think infertility is a symptom like pain. Pain can be caused by many things. Infertility can be caused by many things. Now, I'm aware of the fact that the ASRM has said that it is a disease, but it's a matter of defining what disease is. I like to think of it as a symptom because it's a symptom which can be caused by a variety of diseases. And in that respect, maybe we're quibbling with words, but nevertheless, that's my view.
Dr. Jones, though a month or two early, may I wish you an absolutely wonderful 100th birthday.
Well, thank you. But, you know, I've had 100 birthdays. Because,
How
you know,
is that?
Well, how is that? That's because we don't count the most important birthday in our lives, and that's the real birthday. So if you add that, I've already had 100 birthdays, but I haven't lived 100 years.
Point well taken. From all of us at Medscape, we thank you for your outstanding contributions to the field of IVF, to women's health, and to medicine overall.
Well, thank you, Ali.
On this note, sincere thanks to our viewers for joining us for this special Medscape one-on-one. Until next time, I am Eli Adashi.